Hello, I'm Mercedes Stephenson, and this is the West Block, politics, perspectives, and players. Inauguration ceremonies for Mexico's new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, will be held on December 1st, and his incoming government is making it clear they will not ratify the new trilateral trade deal, USMCA, unless President Trump removes steel and aluminum tariffs. Canada agreed to the USMCA last month with no deal on the tariffs against Canada. Now, Canada's steel industry is calling on the government to follow the Mexican example and refuse to sign the new trade deal unless these tariffs are lifted. To find out why, Mark Rowlinson joins me now from Toronto. He is from the United Steelworkers. Mark, your organization, the United Steelworkers, is calling on the government not to sign this deal unless steel and aluminum tariffs are eliminated. Why?
Because it's completely inconsistent with starting a new trading relationship that's going to govern the economic relationship between Canada and the United States for decades to come, if at the same time key and punishing tariffs that are illegal and unjustified are still exist on key sectors of the economy like steel and aluminum. You cannot on one hand celebrate a free trade agreement and on the other hand have these punishing tariffs imposed by the United States on Canada.
Are you suggesting, though, that this whole agreement should be put on the rails for the sake of steel and aluminum?
Yes, what I'm suggesting is that the government of Canada needs to draw a line in the sand. They need to stand up to Donald Trump, who in our experience is a bit of a bully, and say, these tariffs are unjustified, and if we're going to enter into a free trading partnership, we're not going to accept these national security tariffs we're not going to accept the maintenance of these national security tariffs. That's exactly what I'm suggesting. And indeed, I would note that on Friday, the Mexican Undersecretary of Trade made exactly the same commitment on behalf of the Mexican government. So all we're suggesting is that the Canadian government should stand up to the United States, much like the Mexican government is doing.
But what do you say to those other businesses who are saying that they desperately need to end the uncertainty surrounding trade between Canada and the United States, and they're also looking at a lot of jobs potentially lost in their businesses if this agreement doesn't go ahead?
Well, first of all, the tariffs themselves, both on steel and aluminum and potentially future 232 tariffs on, for example, uranium, are themselves causing a large amount of uncertainty. All we're suggesting is NAFTA continues to be in effect. No one has abrogated NAFTA. All we're suggesting is that before we agree to a revised NAFTA, the USMCA, that these tariffs have to be off the table. And if it takes a little bit longer to get the revised USMCA, I think that we can live with that uncertainty and will benefit from getting rid of these tariffs.
You spoke just a moment ago on the announcement late last week coming from the Mexican government about not signing the USMCA deal unless the tariffs are lifted. Did your organization know ahead of time that that was going to be the Mexican government's position? And have you spoken to any of your counterparts since that announcement?
We did not know that was going to be their position, and to my knowledge, we've not spoken with them since. But it only makes sense that they would take that position, and it only makes sense that Canada would take that position. Again, it's completely inconsistent with the idea of a free trade agreement covering North America if at the same time the United States is imposing punishing tariffs on what is, after all, an integrated market in steel and aluminum in North America.
Have you or anyone from the steel industry spoken directly to the government about not signing on to the USMCA until the tariffs are lifted? And if so, what has the government response been?
Well, we've made many submissions to the federal government on this issue, and of course they're well aware that our union in both the United States and Canada is very much opposed to any tariffs on steel and aluminum between our two countries. The federal government assures us, and I take them at their word, that they're working hard to get rid of these tariffs. We know that the Canadian government, of course, doesn't support the tariffs, but they need to, but in our view, they need to exercise what leverage they have right now in order to get rid of these tariffs. And that leverage exists with the signing of the USMCA. In our view, they had leverage before October the 1st as well, but for reasons that are, I must say, a bit mysterious to us, they failed to exercise the leverage then. All we're saying is you have to exercise the leverage now, and if they don't, if they just go ahead and sign the USMCA with these tariffs still being in place, then they'll have no leverage left whatsoever.
How much have these tariffs cost your industry so far?
So we've had layoffs at Tenera Steel in Sault Ste. Marie. We estimate that roughly 45% of the Canadian steel industry is at risk as a result of these tariffs. Remember that in steel, 90% of our steel exports go to the United States. We've seen a 30% drop in those exports to the United States since the tariffs went into place. And it's not just the loss of jobs, but it's also, and there are we have a lot of unused steel capacity in Canada, in places like Hamilton and Calgary, where there are plants sitting empty, and where we know that there are steel companies who would like to start up those plants and recall some of our members, but they're not going to do it until these tariffs are disposed of. Similarly, in aluminum, we've seen a 50% drop in aluminum exports from Quebec to the United States. And we have plants that are not operating in Quebec that, again, we would like to see get back up and starting, but won't do so until these tariffs are lifted.
How much longer can you keep weathering this if there's no end in sight over the next couple of months, if these tariffs remain in place? Well,
that's exactly the concern. The longer these tariffs are in place, the worse it is going to get for both industries. And that's not just because of the tariffs themselves. It's also because we've seen a spike in imports from other countries, Korea, China, South Korea, and India, into the Canadian steel market in particular. So that's damaging the industry. So if this goes on for many more months, you're going to start seeing more layoffs, and eventually plants are going to shut down as a result of the current trade situation in steel.
And what about relief from the federal government?
So the federal government announced a $2 billion relief package July the 1st, mostly in the form of loan guarantees for the industry. They also announced a $50 million package for workers, which were essentially amendments to the employment insurance regulations. If this goes on much longer, we are going to need substantially more support for the industry, but we certainly hope it won't come to that.
You said earlier that you were quite disappointed the government signed on to the USMCA without insisting the tariffs were lifted as a condition for signing on. What more can you do at this point?
Well, we've been communicating as loudly and as publicly as we can to the Canadian government to make it clear that the 175,000 Canadian workers and their families whose jobs are either directly or indirectly connected to the aluminum and steel industry are counting on the federal government to protect their industry, to stand with those workers, and ultimately get rid of those tariffs. That's what we're doing. Again, it's not a situation where we think the government isn't with us. We know the government itself wants to get rid of the tariffs, but we are just concerned that the government doesn't seem to be willing to stand up and say there will not be a USMCA until such time as these tariffs are dispensed with.
Are you optimistic that your message will get through?
Well, we'll have to see. I should say we're also putting pressure on the U.S. administration as much as possible for them to drop these tariffs. So we're hopeful that by putting as much pressure as we can in both Ottawa and Washington to get rid of these harmful and illegal tariffs, that ultimately, within the next couple of months, those tariffs will be gone.
Thanks so much, Mark Rowlinson, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's all the time we have for today. I'm Mercedes Stephenson for the West Block.